This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In the spring of 2024, 44 pre-kindergarten students and 11 chaperones boarded a school bus for a return trip to their elementary campus from a suburban zoo in Austin, Texas. What should have been a routine ride home became the deadliest school bus crash in nearly a decade in the state. Their bus was struck by a cement pupper truck, a heavy vehicle being driven by a man who was later found to have been at risk being behind the wheel. A 5-year-old boy died in the bus, as did the driver of a third vehicle following behind them. Most of the students on the bus were hurt, some very seriously, and the emotional trauma also left psychic wounds for the children and adults that have yet to heal. In a deeply nuanced series of stories, reporters at the Austin American-Statesman examine this tragedy, including the contributing factors, the aftermath, and where the state's safety regulations for students and motorists fell short. That series, A Fatal Field Trip, received the Hechinger Grand Prize at this year's National Awards for Education Reporting, an honor which recognizes the best of the best from the category winners. Joining us now, representing that winning team, are journalist Keri Heath, the Statesman's K-12 education reporter, and Emiliano Tahui Go. He is the Latino community affairs reporter for the newspaper. Emiliano and Keri, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us, Emily.
Keri, let me start with you. What brought you to the story?
Well, the initial crash happened, as you mentioned, on March 22nd of 2024. And obviously, it was a very traumatic day for all of the families involved in the community of the elementary school. But in the weeks and months following that single day, there was a lot of grief and outpouring of emotion for the families and that community. So in talking with Emiliano and some other colleagues at the paper, I think we really wanted to do justice to the real grief that day meant for the children and their parents who were involved in this crash, and really dig into what such a horrible event meant for those children.
So the reporting broke out, from my reading, into three main areas. You had a narrative, which was sort of a TikTok recounting the events of that fatal day and the different players, the students on the bus, the families, the driver of the other vehicle. And then you had the impact on the survivors, what the fallout's been for them individually. And then you also looked at what could have been done to sort of mitigate the risk and harm of that terrible incident. How did you come to that decision to break it out that way? Were there a lot of planning meetings, or did it just sort of fall that way naturally?
I think initially we wanted to make sure we recounted that day specifically because there was so many events that happened leading up to the crash, and there was a lot of confusion surrounding the initial events. And then the stories that followed really fell out of a lot of questions that we had in the reporting process for that narrative story, and in talking to families and talking to experts. And many of those questions ended up falling into those categories that you just outlined about some of the preventative measures that could have gone into place to make things more safe for these students, to make conditions safer on the road. I don't know if Emiliano, if you want to join in.
Yeah, but let's bring Emiliano to this, because Emiliano, you are the Latino Communities Affair reporter for the newspaper. And we should mention that the majority of the students on this bus were in the English language learner program. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the community that was impacted was very heavily Hispanic. I mean, the suburb that the school was located in is a predominantly, at least plurality, Hispanic suburb, often made of Mexican immigrants. I think in Austin, we have something where our outskirts are often where a lot of our immigrant populations live. And so that's why this is a suburban community that has grown recently and has grown because of the community. And so I think it quickly became apparent to us that this was going to be a story that was influencing, or that had impacted, I should say, a community that was broadly Latino. And because of that was going to have certain barriers to accessing the care that they were going to want to access, and advocating in certain ways for what they were trying to get for themselves, which was often care for themselves, for their kids, and a sense of justice, which often prevails or follows these sorts of accidents.
One of the things we need to talk about from your series were some of the compounding factors, if you will, for the survivors and their families when it came to addressing the harm that they had experienced. And, we sort of had this idea of Americans, if you're in a car accident, the other driver will probably have insurance. That insurance money will come to you as a payout. And then you'll use that money to take care of yourself, whatever needs that you might have. And that certainly wasn't the case here for the survivors of this crash. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I think to kind of go back to the start of your question or your premise, I think it is really interesting that we as Americans have this expectation or understanding that lawsuits and insurance take care of us, right? And so it's like if something bad happens, at least that's there. And then you see these numbers and we always imagine them to be very large, right? And you see the nominal number of 500,000, you're like, well, that's a ton of money. No matter how many people are involved, that's a lot of money. Because of how the legalism works out, the money was split between the two families that had somebody die, right? That had a fatality. And to add to that, there was this number. Yes, there was community support. There was this idea from Buda, which is the suburb, and then also just broadly in Austin of let's donate to this GoFundMe, right? So people were putting tons of money, and you see that number kind of grow and grow. And like, oh, well, there's tons of support there too. But I think as our reporting showed, you split that up with the number of individuals who were in the crash, and that number is between 1,500 and 2,000. It's not a very large number. And so you had families that were hoping they could get some support, especially for medical care. And then, yes, they didn't have it. And so we saw them turn to several things, not many of which were very successful. You had some try to go towards the state because the state has a program for the survivors of crimes, but that's a program that has been not only cut back in the past many years under Governor Greg Abbott, but has also, I think through the reporting of some other outlets, it has shown that it has not been effective in quickly giving support to families. And in the many, many, many months that we were following with these families, they had not been getting responses from this program. So you saw many turn to the legal system, but the legal system is also going to take a long time and it's nowhere near being resolved to this day that we are talking.
And this, I think, is a good point to bring in. Keri, let's talk about where the school system fits into this and help our listeners understand why this is, at its heart, an education story.
Absolutely. These children were under the care of the school district at this time. They were on a field trip to visit the zoo, and all of the adults on this bus were teachers or were volunteers for the school district. And the school district had buses, in their care that had seatbelts, but this bus, as we write a story, did not. And, one of the things that we spent a lot of time investigating and looking into as part of this project was the use of seatbelts in Texas and why buses throughout Texas still, by and large, in many cases, do not have seatbelts, even for children as young as those that were on this bus, many of which were 4 or 5. And so, there was big questions raised by a lot of the families we were talking to about why this bus did not have those restraints, why they did not have these safety features. And, I do want to be clear that the research that I looked into made very apparent that even without seatbelts, school buses are still really safe vehicles. But this was a huge concern of a lot of the families that were on this bus. And, it was a huge concern of a lot of the other families at Tom Green Elementary afterwards. They were reporting that they didn't want to send their kid on the bus just to go to school after this because they were concerned that it might not have seatbelts. So this raised a lot of conversation in the community at school board meetings, at the campus, about the role that the district should have played in making sure these children were safe.
And Texas law does require that these buses have seatbelts. Is that correct? You wrote about this 2017 law, and I'm just curious, can you explain to our audience why it's not enforced?
Yeah, it does. It's a little yes, but. So Texas is actually one of a very small handful of states that has any kind of law requiring any kind of seatbelt at all, which I thought was very interesting. But the law that was on the books at the time that we wrote this story only required seatbelts for buses that were purchased in 2018 or later, and required exemptions for districts if they didn't have the funds to cover these buses. Now, there was a new law that just passed here in Texas that eliminated the time requirement. So districts can still exempt themselves if they don't have the funds, but all buses technically now have to be equipped with seatbelts.
I want to talk to you. You took the lead in the reporting on the families and the impact there. And it can be difficult to talk to children at any time, especially very young children. But once who've been through trauma, there are particular cautions, and you have to be especially careful in how you approach that. So, where were you having most of these interviews? Were you going to their homes, or were you meeting in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be clear. A lot of our reporting was through the parents because the kids were very, very young, and oftentimes the parents would give us permission to talk to them. We're relatively quiet and coy, and in a sense, the former reporting with them was, asking questions and seeing kind of how they reacted and kind of seeing how they were interacting with their parents. The parents would send us, for example, videos of how their kids were interacting with their siblings and whatnot. And we were kind of trying to make sense as to how the parents were noticing, right, the changes that they saw in their children. But yes, this reporting was often done at the houses. I mean, it was a lot of driving down from Austin to Buda and meeting these parents in person, meeting them at the places that they would go to commonly, like frequently, like church camp or like where they would go for the therapy of their children. So it was kind of meeting them where they were having this day-to-day of grappling with what had happened and trying to make it past that we got a sense of them and were able to learn what their experiences had been like.
How did you build trust with these families? I mean, you have to do it on deadline.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we were grateful for is that our editors were telling us, I mean, one, give the time to these stories, keep coming back to them. Because as Keri mentioned, I mean, I think our original hope was let's write a story that tells what happened that day and in the immediate aftermath. And that's kind of that first narrative story that we produced. And then from that, we realized it was going to take time to kind of break down the effects of it. And so that was like, how do we keep up with these families for a few months, for many months actually, to make sense of the financial costs and the mental health burdens, and then how do we keep up with other things? But I think to go back to answering the question of how do you build the trust, I think it's being, in a sense, very slow in terms of asking about things and making sure that you let the families sort of forefront what is most important to them. I think as you ask questions, you'll notice that families come back to things, and that's in a sense telling you what is most stood out to them, what is most ingrained in them and in their sense of self. And I think that's what we're trying to share.
We're talking with the reporting team from the Austin American-Statesman on their project, A Fatal Field Trip, which won the Hechinger Grand Prize at this year's National Awards for Education Reporting. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your very favorite podcast apps. And many thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on Apple Podcasts. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. So, Keri, Emiliano, we've talked a little bit about what you found, and now I want to turn and talk a little bit more about how you did it and some of the journalistic skills that you put into practice here, sharpened, and maybe some new ones you picked up that you can share with our audience, who many of them are education journalists and reporters just like you. So, Keri and Emiliano, what was it like working as a team? Have you ever done this before? This kind of team reporting, sharing notes, going back and forth, brainstorming on this kind of a project?
I have worked on teams before, but not quite to something of this scale, where we had multiple stories over many months that we were working on. And I found it really gratifying because we all have different skills and backgrounds with reporting. And I thought it was really helpful to be able to, especially on the narrative story, work through every line. And we were all coming with different pieces of reporting that we really loved or that we really struggled with. And so it was very helpful to have a team work through, the sticking points, the challenges that we were facing. Emiliano, I don't know if you want to speak to some of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I never worked on such large stories together as a team. And so to me, what stood out was, in a sense, the sort of the unexpected sort of joy that I found in kind of being able to work through writing often with colleagues. I mean, that's something I think, all experienced when we were writing some of the very longer stories, and especially that narrative story together of seeing how things could be reworked through different people's ideas. And yeah, I think the team worked well together because it understood, or because we were able to come to understandings of what each person should do.
We should mention there was a third member of your team, and that was Tony Pohetsky, who is an investigative reporter with the newspaper. What did you pick up from him working with Tony?
I think working with Tony was really helpful for this project to making a fine polish on some of the investigative pieces. For me personally, I think he was really helpful with making the narrative in the first piece sing, and making sure we were getting every time stamp correct, and making sure we were really getting digging into the reporting as much as possible.
I would add, I think what Tony and I think what some of the editors were very helpful with was oftentimes helping Keri and I, who are younger reporters or earlier reporters, and maybe I shouldn't say for Keri because I'm earlier on in my career than she is, but helping us understand kind of what has to be touched on in the story. I think the example I can give is the final story we worked on, which was a look very broadly across the state as to the impact on the reduced number of commercial vehicle enforcement, which is not a sexy term or kind of thing to look into by any means, but it's this idea of, how is the state trying to make sure that commercial vehicles are, have their brakes in order, following weight limits, hours of service in terms of how much drivers aren't overworking themselves, all things that played into this crash and can play into other crashes. And it was like, how do you get the perspective of various people throughout the state, and who are these organizations in something that is so niche, right, that are actually thinking about this? Because when you think of how do I break down something like the enforcement, the inspection of large trucks, I mean, you have to kind of think about what are the very specific groups of government workers, of people in the industry that care about this, but that we as everyday people, and even we as journalists that are occasionally reporting about these topics, just don't think or aren't able to find. And I think Tony and many of our other editors were very helpful in helping us make sense of that.
So going over multiple months, obviously you hit roadblocks in this story. And I'm curious if you could share maybe one or two of them and how you overcame them. There's maybe some commonality for our listeners out there.
Yeah, I would say in particular for the story about seatbelts, I had some issues with data in particular because the state doesn't do a great job about keeping data on the number of seatbelts on school buses in the state. And so I had to kind of reverse engineer how to get at the scale of this issue. And so I sort of did a microscope in which I collected data at the local level. And then I worked with a sort of a subset of what I was looking for that the state did collect. They collect data on purchases where I really wanted kind of like the number of school buses with seatbelts total. And, I really just kind of worked at talking to experts and industry leaders to contextualize the pieces of data that I did have to work around what I didn't have that I really wish I could have had to make a finer point on the story. So that's one example. I know, Emiliano, you had some challenges of your own. I don't know if you want to talk about those.
I think one of the things that I think was very large to the story, kind of continuing on the series of that final story regarding data and regarding looking at commercial vehicle enforcements across the state, which I think our investigation was able to show, because of the politicization of our state police force, really has changed across the state, and we have some big gaps across the state because of how much attention we've given to the border. And that's something that's interesting, and that ties into perhaps the lack of safety that we're seeing on our roads here in Central Texas. But when it came to reporting that story out and kind of getting the original sets of data and trying to comb through them and make sense of them, that we got from the Texas Department of Public Safety, which is not only the agency of our state troopers, but that also oversees, from a technical side, commercial vehicle enforcement here in Texas, was we were seeing numbers, or I should say trends, that were concerning to us, but in our initial outreaches to the agency, they kind of dismissed us, and they were like, those are just flukes, what you're seeing. And so I think what was very important to this story was being sourced in the trucking industry and going back to many people and saying, listen, this is what we're seeing. Are we totally crazy here? And help us make sense as to why there might be something here, so that we can continue to push the state agency on this, that is not very eagerly giving out information. And that was important to continuously badger them on that. And then over time, they very much changed their tone. They're like, okay, we see that what you guys are seeing. I mean, again, this is talking to their public information officers because of the access they gave us, and then making them give us what we believe were much more honest answers.
Let's talk a little bit about what the reaction has been to your story, and has anything changed in Texas?
Well, we are hearing from folks in the education community that this has been pretty a talker among folks. I think it's definitely shedding some light on the struggles that those families have gone through. We did, as I mentioned, have a new law about seatbelts specifically pass this session. I can't say it was because necessarily of our reporting and speaking with the senator who introduced the law. It was brought to him from a constituent, but it'll be really interesting to see how the law, which requires the reporting that I mentioned I really wanted for my piece and didn't have, how that reporting plays out over the next few years. And I will be eager to get my hands on some of that data. But overall, I mean, talking with folks in the Buda community and other education leaders that I talk to on a regular basis, I think it was, important to shed light on the struggles that those families have gone through.
One thing that I think I've been keeping tabs on is kind of seeing if because we saw a lot of difficulties in these families trying to access what was often funding for uninsured services, health services, which in this case were the mental health services for their children. And I think the story put on the record another example as to how the lack of state support there really does put families in very precarious positions. But I don't think we've seen change there. And I'm very eager to continue to follow that, because I think that's somewhere where we think is important to continue to follow on. But I would mention that something that has happened since our reporting, again, it's not that we can directly tie it, but is the state of Texas has removed one of the obscure emissions of a type of truck, which in this case is the concrete pump truck, the truck that crashed into this Tom Green school bus, from its list of vehicles that were exempted from state regulations. And, to what extent the state did that on its own behalf, I don't know, but I think that's something that we have at least seen the state respond to, which I thought was very productive.
I want to turn to the national awards. Keri, you were with us in St. Louis. Were you surprised when they called your team's name for the Hechinger Grand Prize?
Yes, I was, because there's so much excellent reporting that gets submitted to EWA every year. And that was the case this year as well.
Where is the Hechinger Grand Prize right now? For our listeners who haven't seen it, it's a very beautiful glass sculpture. It also comes with a $10,000 check. But I'm curious, is it in your newsroom?
It is. Right now, it's actually sitting on Emiliano's desk.
Are you time sharing? What's happening here?
I was on vacation out of the country until yesterday. And so I think maybe I'm going to go in the office today. Maybe that's Keri's very kind way of showing it to me.
Yeah, yes. I thought it would be good for him to see it when he walks in from vacation.
In addition to the prize, obviously, how did you enjoy National Seminar? Any big takeaways for you there?
Oh, I love the EWA seminar. This year was my third year going, and I always just think it's such a wealth of knowledge. It's great to connect with reporters that I see once a year, and I come away with a million ideas. There were so many, and that was the case this year as well. I've got a notebook full of things I'm not going to have time to get to this summer.
Well, Emiliano, we would love to see you there next year. One of our traditions is to have the prior year's grand prize winners hand out the next one. So we hope that both of you can join us in Baltimore in 2026.
We'd love to be there. It'd be an honor.
Any final words of advice for reporters who may be listening and may be thinking about following up on perhaps school bus safety in their own states, or even tackling a big project? Any last words, Keri?
I would just say dig beyond the breaking news and try to really think about long-term impacts for families that are impacted by, traumatic events that happen during the school year.
And Emiliano, any words from you?
Just similarly, I think find the stories that you think need more digging, and find the ways to advocate with your editors. I know in many of our local newsrooms, our small newsrooms, we're all very crunched for time. So it's finding the way to have those conversations with the editors that you do need time to do this, because it will hopefully shed a light on things that aren't getting any attention. And I think we're very grateful for our editors in our newsroom for giving us that time to have done this reporting.
One of the ways that you can get some of that time is to apply for an EWA reporting fellowship. We offer both micro fellowships at about $5,000 and full fellowships of $10,000 on regular cycles. Our next cycle will be in the fall of 2025, so keep an eye on your inboxes for information about that. Keri Heath, Emiliano Tahui Go, thank you so much for making time for EWA Radio. It was a pleasure to hear from you.
Appreciate being here.
Thank you for having us, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporters that you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 78 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.